Now, in the previous two sessions, we've talked about streaming, about applications, what you can stream, how you can stream. So really in this session, we wanted to dig down more into the technology of where we like to watch what we're streaming, and that's really on our televisions, right? I mean, that's really our biggest screen. It's great to watch things, on our little phones, but you don't really get the greatest experience, right? You want to be able to sit back and watch it on the big TV. So that means
Right.
you're going to need a TV, right? So maybe it's time to upgrade, right? You've got that TV, you've got your streaming going, and you think, now we could get a better resolution and maybe even a lot more inches in the size of that screen. What should I be looking for? Number one, and arguably the most important thing, is to make sure that you get a 4K television. Uh, High definition televisions for a while have really been that 1080p, and there's a limitation with 1080p where really its best picture is about the 35 to 40 inch range. You could get TVs sometimes up to 50 inches in 1080p standard high definition. But there's really tricks that they do with chips to make that possible. When 4K televisions were introduced, that really allowed the 50-inch to 75-inch televisions to become available with those really beautiful pictures. So if you're in the market now, you're going to want a 4K. And the reality is really anytime you're in a store now, that's usually the minimum that they're offering is a 4K television. So one, just make sure it's 4K. And keep in mind too that 4K looks a lot better when you're gaming and when you're watching sports compared to 1080p. There are some newer 8K televisions which have even much greater resolution and are allowing for much bigger screen sizes. But here's the deal. You're going to pay a lot more for that, and there's really not a lot of 8K content out there yet. There's really no place to get it. You might be able to enjoy it if you have a Blu-ray player. I'm 46, 47, who's counting? I don't think I remember the last time I was at someone's home and they said, let's watch this movie using my Blu-ray. So the reality is 4K is going to have you covered. Make sure it's a 4K television. Now there's another number that you'll see with the 4K, and that's usually what's called the hertz, and it'll be 60 hertz or 120 hertz. You don't want anything lower than 60 hertz. Now that hertz is the refresh rate. The refresh rate of a TV measured in hertz refers to the number of times per second the display resets the message or the image. So at 60, you can essentially look at it as there's 60 pictures you're actually seeing each second, 60 frames per second. And at 120 hertz, 120 frames per second. Obviously, 120 is better than 60. The reality is that 4K 60 looks pretty amazing at the 50-inch to 75-inch models for television. But if you're somebody who wants to have the top of the line, then you would want to look at 120 hertz refresh rate. Another factor to consider when buying a television, and we'll talk a little bit more about HDMI cables in a minute, or the number of HDMI ports on the back of your television. Why? Well, two reasons. One, you're going to have devices connected to that television. Maybe it's an Apple TV, maybe it's a Fire Stick, maybe you're connecting it directly to your router if it happens to be close to it, etc. And you want to be able, and you might have a soundbar, and I'll talk about that. And those are all going to go into these HDMI ports. So if you're limited for whatever reason in that model of television that you're buying, that means you're going to be limited to the number of devices you can connect. There are separate devices you can buy that allow you to essentially connect all the devices to like a connector or a switch, and then use one of these ports on the back of the television. The problem with that, though, is it's a little clunky for two reasons. One, you have to manage then the devices connected on that switch. So think, I want to watch something on my Apple TV, and that's device number one on my switch. And now I want to watch something from my Fire Stick, and that's on number two on my switch. and that's connected to one HDMI port on my television, well, you have to select it from the switch selector and make sure you're also correctly selecting it from the HDMI port on your television. Now, is it the end of the world? No, but it just makes it a little clunky. There's also a challenge, though, of the weakest link, right? You're connecting a device, a streaming device, to your television, right? So you've got that device, you've got your television, and then you have an HDMI cable, which I'm going to talk about. If you stick something else in the middle of that, that's just another point where you can have a weak link. And so you might have a high-end device and a high-end television and high-end cables connecting it together, but you have a low-end switch, and that can cause problems with your picture or your sound. So that's why you just kind of want the HDMI ports built into the television. It looks cleaner, you have less clutter, and often just leads to a better experience. Now, if you are upgrading your television, particularly an older model, if you have one of those bigger box models, but really any television now, we're all recognizing that they're amazingly thin, and they seem to only be getting thinner. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But there is a drawback to getting thinner and thinner TVs. That means you don't have any room for speakers, right? When we had big box televisions, you could have big box speakers in there. Now, when these TVs are this thick, well, where can you have the speaker, right? How big can that speaker be? And there's only so much you can do, even with technology, with putting out immersive, deep, loud sound that's reverberating to match this big 50, 60, 75-inch screen that you have, right? So that means you're going to want to get a sound bar. And that's, that is an additional cost. And so a sound bar is really what it sounds like. It's really, this is a sound bar. Would connect via HDMI to your television, your new thin fancy TV, right? And I'm going to show you some options here that tend to exist out there, say even at your local Best Buy. But one thing that I would recommend is that you get one with a wireless subwoofer. Some sound bars it's just the sound bar that you can buy, and it has a subwoofer built into the sound bar. But if you have a wireless subwoofer that comes with it, it is so much better. And you notice it when you're watching or you want to hear that bass in a movie. Think of when the dinosaur is walking in Jurassic Park or the Transformers transforming. You can almost feel the reverberations in your couch or your recliner with that wireless subwoofer. And it really does make the experience just that much greater. And you think, great, I'm going to get a new TV, and now I got to go buy a soundbar. How much does that cost? They're actually quite affordable. So I just went to Best Buy and I said, what's available today in the store? I don't want to look for ordering stuff that you have to ship. Just what do you have in the store right now? And I sorted it by 3 different ways, by the best rated, the lowest cost, and the best selling. However it is, Best Buy defines that. And it just so happens that Samsung was all the 3 options, and they had 3 different models. And you can see the price range here from $120 to essentially $300. So, it doesn't break the bank, but it is an extra expense in getting that new TV. You're arguably going to want a soundbar and one with a wireless subwoofer, as these 2 options have. Now, there are some soundbars out there that cost $1,000, $2,000, $3,000. Those are super high-end soundbars. And if you're an audiophile and also maybe want to link your phone and so you can, play your music out of that, hey, that's one thing. But let me tell you, I've got a general Sony soundbar. It sounds amazing. I can connect my phone to it as well and play music. And it sounds like I have multiple speakers. And that soundbar probably cost me about $150 a couple years ago. So you can get by with something in that price range and really have some great sound coming out of your TV while you're streaming. Now, another option you're going to have to consider when buying a television is, should I get an LCD, a QLED, or an OLED, right? You'll see those words on the TVs as you're walking through and looking at all the screens in the store. So it's important to know what's the difference here, right? What does all this mean? Why should I care? What am I buying, right? Well, here's how CNET breaks it down. OLED stands for Organic Light Emitting Diode. And that's essentially exactly what it does. That means each pixel in the screen lights up by itself. Okay, Organic Light Emitting Diode. Now, QLED, and it says according to Samsung, and I'll explain that in a minute here, but Sony actually developed the quantum dot LED technology with another company. But then Samsung now owns the trademark to quantum dot. But it stands for quantum dot LED TV. And it's essentially an LCD LED with quantum dots, so much smaller dots. But it still has a backlight like an LCD. So an LCD TV and a QLED TV need lights in the back to light up the little pixels so that you can see them. And when there's a dark part of the screen or a black in the screen, the light needs to go out. An OLED, on the other hand, the individual pixel lights up or turns off to create darks or lights and to show you color, okay? Now, in the end, what that means is that OLED tends to make much richer blacks. And it's very noticeable when you have an OLED and a QLED or an LCD together, that if you're watching the same picture, the same movie, that the darks just look richer and cleaner on there than they do on QLED or LCD TVs. Now, liquid crystal displays, they've been around forever. Most of our monitors used to be LCD, our LCD monitors. It's a very proven technology, but again, it uses a backlight to illuminate the screen. They tend to be more affordable. And, they do use some more power compared to OLED and QLED, but they're bezel-less, meaning there's really not a whole lot of side, on the side of the television. Almost the screen can go the full length, and the pictures can be quite beautiful. But if I'm being honest, QLED is better than LCD because it's really taking LCD to the next level with quantum dots, and OLED is arguably better than QLED, but it does have some drawbacks. And so let's just consider why that might be. Well, first with QLED, it uses a special LED backlight system, and it can have 2, 4, 6, 8 backlights, or maybe even 30 or 40 backlights in the back of that television so that you can have dark areas and more lit areas. Again, it just depends on the model that you're getting. And that's why it's good to kind of usually look at the television or look at the screen in the store to make sure it's going to produce the kind of picture that you're happy with. Now, again, 7 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10, you're going to be quite happy with whatever you get, even if you just bought it online. But if you're someone who really wants to see that difference in the picture and know that's going to be your TV for the next, who knows, 6, 8, 10 years, there is something about being in the store and just seeing it, seeing it presented. Now with OLED, again, this is the organic light emitting, where each pixel turns on and off by itself, the light within it. Really allows for those deeper blacks. It also allows for a better viewing angle. So you'll notice sometimes if you're at someone's house and you're looking at the television, sometimes if you get too off to the side and you're looking at the screen, it kind of fades out a little bit, right? You almost have like a tunnel where the best seat is the one right in front of it. That tends to be the case with LCD. QLED makes improvements on that, but is still affected by that, where sometimes there are angles that you just doesn't see, like the color starts to look off just because of the way the technology is. Well, with OLED, you can pretty much be anywhere and you're going to see that perfect picture and contrast regardless, because it's not using a backlight or backlights to light up the picture. So it's not affected by your angle because that individual pixel is lit up by itself. And so that is something that's noticeable. Now, what's a challenge with OLEDs? One, in the 50 to 65 inch size television range, they're very comparable in price to QLED. But once you get over 65 inches in OLED, the price tends to skyrocket. And it's just because of how they make these televisions. They do cost more. Sometimes they're thousands and thousands of dollars more once you get over the 65-inch size. But in the 50 to 65-inch range, they're very comparable. OLED can also, unfortunately, result in what's called burn-in. Because if you think about it, like any light that you turn on and turn off, eventually that light can burn out. Now, with LCD and QLED, you have backlights, right? But with the OLED, it's that individual pixel turning on. So if you always have a pixel on, well, you're going to, burn it out over time, or might burn out at a different rate. And you would think, well, when would that happen? It's not like I'm just going to leave the screen on pause. Sure, you wouldn't want to do that. And the manufacturers know about that. So they know to kind of have a screen that comes on and things are moving around if you pause your TV for too long. But think like, for example, if you always watch ESPN or you're always watching CNN or Fox News, something that has a chyron or a logo always in the corner of the screen. Well, that means that those particular pixels are always going to be on and always one color, right? And that can then mean that that particular area of the screen eventually burns out faster than other parts, or just burns out, period. Now, it's not something that I have ever heard of happening, but it's clearly something that people talk about. It's just something to consider. So if you're somebody who watches a particular network that has, say, a chyron running or a logo in the screen all the time, might be something you'd want to consider. So in summary, LCD uses a backlight with liquid crystals. QLED is really a step up from LCD with quantum dots, and OLED is those self-lit pixels. And I'll tell you, I don't have an OLED. I would love to have one. I think my next TV personally would be an OLED, but that burn-in is something that people do talk about. Again, I've never heard of anyone running into that issue, but it is what it is. So, any questions there, Julie or Paula?
Did you say the pricing for the LED is a lot more or similar? I didn't catch the beginning.
For QLED and OLED, they're quite similar up to 50 to 65 inches. But once you get over 65 inches, OLED pricing for whatever reason, it really skyrockets. But 65 inches is pretty big. I think 75 inches is usually what people have as the biggest television in their house right now, unless you're talking about a theater, right?
Right.
So, there's that. But you get 4K televisions now that are 50 inches, sometimes for like $200.
Now, I see that.
Is it the top of the line? Does it have multiple HDMI ports? Maybe not, but they still often look really great. I mean, it's like, who are we kidding here? They do look great. It's just a matter of, do you want to get the best or really see that difference? It's like when somebody's in your house, they're like, wow, that's a beautiful picture, that kind of thing. So
yeah,
that's why we're covering this. This is the deeper streaming tips and tricks.
Yeah. Well, like when you go to Best Buy or somewhere and you see them all together, you can definitely see differences.
That's right.
Quality.
And sometimes it's good just to get out there just so you can kind of see it yourself, and then you can go home and maybe do some research and know, I saw there's a difference. And obviously there's some companies, there's some common names. Samsung in particular is really the leader in quantum dots. But obviously, LG has really come up over the last 10, 15 years and become a leader in television. Sony is still there. They don't always have the award-winning sets. I've got a Sony television though. It was actually quite affordable when I got it 4 years ago. So, but it is something to be in there just to kind of see and compare.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the cables, right? Because you've got the television and then you need to connect it to your Apple TV, your Fire Stick, your Chrome device, your gaming system, who knows? Could be anything that you're connecting, right, that you're trying to watch. watch things from. And in the beginning, it was really simple, right? You just buy one, right? You need an HDMI cable, let me get one. Well, now there's lots of versions, and we need to keep that in mind, because what can happen is if you don't have the latest standard, which really means that it can send more data along that cable, you might lose out on some either features or functionality. Your picture might not work, or your sound might not work so well, if it works at all. You're like, well, that's a problem, right? Want it to work. So HDMI stands for High Definition Multimedia Interface. And it's really just sending the data, right? The data from that device to your television, and sometimes even back to the device. One thing to keep in mind, when you're buying a cable, you want to get this standard HDMI 2.1. That should be more than sufficient for anything that we're talking about today, even for the latest gaming consoles that want to take advantage of the best resolution that you might be getting on your television, but HDMI 2.1. And just keep in mind, this obviously is what you connect your things to, how you connect your TV to those things. But as I said, there are different standards out there, different versions, right? And you'll often see this wording or naming on the HDMI packaging, and it'll say standard or high speed HDMI or premium or ultra high speed. Now, these are backwards compatible, meaning you can usually, with no problem, buy a higher standard and it'll work with lower standard devices. So, for example, Apple will tell you, and I'll show you this in a minute, they actually just recommend you get the ultra high speed cable. Now, it's capable of doing 8K at 60 hertz. You're not going to be getting 8K at 60 hertz from your 4K Apple TV, much less if you don't have an 8K television, right? But it's also capable of doing 4K at 120 and 4K at 160, which means you just cross everything off and therefore you're okay, right? So the one thing to keep in mind from this slide alone is there are different standards of HDMI cables. At minimum, get a premium high-speed cable, if not an ultra high-speed cable. And I'm going to show you one in a minute, how much they cost. You can get them for like $25. It doesn't break the bank. But what can happen is that you can find out, and I'll show you in a minute, where even your Apple TV will say, hey, you're not getting the best that you can because of the cable that you're using. And so just to avoid that, it's just better to get the higher standard. You should also know that there are also 3 connector types. There's the standard, and that's what we're talking about here for televisions. There's also a mini, and there's also a micro. And the standard, you can imagine, are for bigger devices like TVs and computer monitors. The mini is used for things like camcorders and laptops, and then the micro for notebook computers and maybe action cameras, that kind of thing. They all do the same thing. It's just a different connection, right? Because I feel like sometimes these companies want to make money with different connections. But obviously you can see the utility of having a smaller connection for smaller devices. But for our purpose, it'll be this standard device for our televisions. And here's what Apple says. So it's kind of funny. It says, number 1, use the correct input and settings. Well, thanks a lot, Apple. That's great advice, right? But it says, depending on your TV, you may need to use a different HDMI input on your TV for high quality 4K or HDR video. And this HDR stands for high dynamic range. And so sometimes you'll notice I said you want one that has many ports, and sometimes those HDMI ports have little designations that say that they're special, right? And it's just keeping that in mind. So you want to connect your special device using the special port, whereas maybe the other HDMI ports are just standard ports, where these are going to allow for higher data transfer. And so that might be why you see an error message, or why you're like, well, I have a 4K television that does 120 hertz, but it's saying I can only use 60 hertz for some reason. But I have a 4K 120. Why am I only able to watch a 4K at 60 hertz? And it could be because your cable isn't allowing for that. So that's something to, something to keep in mind. Apple also says if there's an issue, you can actually run a test. Now, I'm just giving you an example of Apple because that's the one I primarily use. But from your Apple 4K television, when you're clicking around in the settings, you can actually run a 2-minute test to check your HDMI connection to give you information about whether or not maybe it's your cable that's preventing something. Also on some televisions, you actually have to go into the settings and select the higher resolution rates or higher video rates manually. So, that's also something to keep in mind. So if you're setting up a new television, you will want to spend a couple minutes going through your settings and saying, hey, I got a 4K television that does this. Am I actually on that in the settings? Because you can downgrade what your monitor, what your television is showing. You want to make sure that by default you're at the highest, and is it working there? Then stay there. And then if for some reason it's not, then you can tighter down and see what might be an issue. Apple itself just says we just recommend you get the Belkin ultra high speed HDMI cable and just be done with it. And it just so happens they sell it, and so just so you can see, what that kind of runs with them, I think it's $30, right? You can get it, and of course, sometimes you might get it cheaper from Best Buy, but that's the kind of investment that we're talking about in the cable. And you'll notice that this cable, made by Belkin in this case, supports up to 7680 by 4320 resolution. So think of that as almost like the resolution, right? Almost length times width in a way. It's not exactly that, but you can consider it that way. Now, a 4K Apple 4K TV, when I say Apple TV 4K, that's just the box, right, that you connect to your TV. It only supports a resolution of 4096 by 2160. Well, that's obviously smaller than this. So this cable is capable of doing more than even the Apple TV 4K can put out. But because it's more capable, it's more than sufficient, right? And it's not the cable that's going to give you a problem. Ergo, Apple says just get this one, be done with it, and you won't have any issues.